the station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Good morning, and welcome to part 3 of Cities in History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I'm talking again about Havana. Now, the thing about Havana is it has a very long history, and it has a very complex history with a lot of different people, a lot of different places, and a lot of different things that are happening inside of Havana, a lot of interactions that go beyond Havana's borders that add to the city and make it more diverse and more interesting. So it's very challenging to choose only 20 objects to describe a city, and I have to be careful about my time because last week I was only up to the 1600s. Havana's founded in the 1500s, and somehow I have to get to modern day, and most historians of Cuba and most historians who tend to look at these things, especially a small island country like Cuba that's been so significant in the 20th century, get lost on the revolution and Fidel Castro and the current geopolitical position of Havana. There's so many interesting stories that happen in and around Havana. It's easy to ignore the long days they had under the Spanish Empire, where the industry wasn't as big, the interactions might not have been as global or as diverse, and they might not have been as relevant for as many people, but it's still part of this city history, and it's still what makes Havana, Havana. So, looking at week 3, I want to sort of understand how Havana begins to understand its diversity and begins to sort of select itself its own route and its own identity. So last week I talked about the Cruz de la Para, so brought by Christopher Columbus, this representation of Christianity, which is going to play a central role in the development of the sacred city in Havana. And I juxtaposed that with a very challenging and very troubling item, the shackles, because slavery was such an enormous industry in Havana and certainly played a role and continued to play a role all the way until 1886 and even beyond, when slavery is ended in 1886, but even beyond that. So Havana continues to be in this process of change. Now, we can see cities as processes of change. We can see, there's been arguments that almost anything is a process. There's no things. There are no stagnant things. And a city is no exception to that. So I had to choose 2 items. I had to choose something that's going to bring us into the 18th century, move us beyond the 1600s into the 1700s. And I thought one of the projects that could do that, one of the processes, one of the items that goes beyond the 16th century, that goes into the 17th century, and really into present day, is the city wall of Havana. So if you go to Havana today as a tourist, you can still see the city wall. And it's not serving the purpose of keeping people out in the way that it was intended to do, or keeping the city secure like it once was. It's a ruin of what it once was, but that's been the story for this city wall since it was originally founded. The city wall, although first completed in 1680, went through numerous renovations. Numerous times it was taken down and rebuilt on new borders. Numerous times it was destroyed. Havana, as we'll talk about later in the show, happens to sit at a very crucial place in the Caribbean that tends to be hit by hurricanes. But the wall was a project that the Spanish had in their minds for a long time. Now, one thing the wall does is it keeps people out. You might be familiar with talks of walls if you pay attention to politics in any sort of way today. Walls are intended to keep people out and secure people within. So there are people within the walls and people without the walls. The Spanish called those intramuros, extramuros, inside the wall or outside the wall. Now, the Spanish were trying to secure the city and trying to keep certain things out. So the question is, what were they trying to keep out? I already mentioned that the Taino were likely basically removed from Cuba, killed by the Spanish, either enslaved or sent away. Some escaped to the hills, and those communities, runaway slave communities and indigenous communities, tend to move toward the center of the island where the Spanish were not so interested in interacting. So the Spanish, to them, Havana was important because it was a port. It gave access to the sea. At that time, at the early days in the beginning of the 17th century, they're not producing in a whole lot in Havana. Really, it's a trading post. So they're not worried about what's happening inside. In fact, the indigenous that do survive escape to the hills. And those communities, cimarrones, we'll talk about them later, but for the purpose of this discussion, that's one of the things the wall might protect. A wall might protect from native groups or from runaway slaves interacting and getting both the benefits or hurting the city in any way. So the wall was a project that was intending to secure the city. It was first completed in 1680 and connects the two forts, La Fuerza and La Punta. Now, the importance of this wall cannot be understated, both symbolically and as a wall. But today I want to focus on the symbolic nature of the wall, and that will lead into our next couple weeks and the next couple discussions we have about this sort of people inside the wall and people outside the wall, and what that means and what that meant for the city of Havana and what it continues to mean as the wall is still there, sort of dividing old Havana from new Havana. So what was happening outside the wall? Like I said, inland, there's some runaway slave communities, there's some native communities, there are farmlands, there are some modest settlements. People who are farming tobacco at this point might be outside of the wall. It's still possible to be farming inside the wall. It's not totally filled up, Havana, at this point. And the walls continue to be built. There's hurricanes come, knock some of the walls down, and they have to be rebuilt. Now, sugar cultivation is also increasing, and the need for land for tobacco and sugar is also increasing. So it's becoming more difficult to get land within the city of Havana in order to grow sugar, grow tobacco. So people are also moving outside of the city, maybe Spanish who aren't so wealthy, who have to man the plantations and make sure the slaves are working, things like that, are going to be out there in the plantation, where the more wealthy Spanish and those who are trading are going to be inside the city. Now, so you can see all this development happening in the map around Havana Harbor, and this is an interesting time where there's also a bunch of villas and a bunch of towns going up on the other side of Havana Harbor, and those become more significant later as our story continues to progress. So a couple things that I also want to mention that happen inside the wall. So we've established farmland is sort of expanding Havana's, becoming more of a producer in its own right rather than just a port and a trading post. Inside, it's developing itself as well. And in 1704, there is a Jesuit college that is built, but that's not even the biggest college. And the emergence of what we now know as the University of Havana, what was then known as the University of St. Jerome, is established both by a papal decree and by a royal decree. So the King of Spain and the Pope both agree that Havana is an important enough city. It's going to be the home of this new university, the College of San Geronimo de la Habana. And it's established inside the city in order to continue to improve education, in order to push forth this mission of the sacred city, and in order to really develop those who are in Havana and who are basically becoming Cuban, basically becoming Havanese rather than just the Spanish coming over. Now, it's important to note that these sort of things did not just happen overnight. These were long processes that took a very long time, and talk of building this university had begun decades earlier in the late 1600s. Talk of opening a potential papal and royal university in Havana to make the city more important. And it took years and years, and other institutions had been established, but it's really not until 1728 that this Royal and Pontifical University of San Geronimo opens, and it becomes one of the first royal universities, one of the biggest institutions of higher learning in Latin America, certainly at that time. Now, when it's first established, the Jesuits have their own school. It's not quite as big, and it isn't opened by royal decree. So the University of San Geronimo, is actually run by Dominicans. And the courses are what you might expect from the middle 1700s. They're taught by Dominican priests. It's mostly memorization of Latin texts, and the students are typically wealthy Spaniards. Some religious certainly are there. But the education system is not one for everyone there. If you're a merchant, you're not going to college. If you're a trader or a soldier, you're not going to be going to college. There's a certain class that is definitely populating this university, which sort of shows that that's a nice place to be in opposition to those who are outside the wall laboring in this Havana heat, obviously. Now, the University of San Geronimo continues, and it lasts. It is in its present form the University of Havana, and this is one of the neat things of the city. The layers of the city continue to build upon themselves. So even though the university is established in 1728, even though you can imagine these Dominicans teaching the courses, memorization in Latin, those sort of things, it's still there in Havana in a different form. So just a brief overview of the university. In 1842, it is secularized and actually given to the government of Havana, which is still part of the Spanish Empire, and it becomes University of Havana in 1842, and then that continues all the way to the present day. So just in review, the two items that I've chosen this week, the wall and the diploma to represent the university, although it's not necessarily likely that they gave out diplomas back in the 1700s, it's more of a symbol of the university, shows that there's sort of a divide happening. And this divide will be a theme that we continue to take as we go along in the history of Havana, because both its divide and interactions that tend to make cities useful to study for historians and make cities compelling and interesting places where we can look at these interactions that build up things like Cuban identity, Havana identity, and cultural and social history that we're going to be getting in further as we move on. So thanks again for joining us. This is just week 3 of a 10-part series. I'm talking about Havana history in items. I'm going to choose 20 items that represent the history of Havana. Thank you for joining Cities in History, a project of the Hour of History podcast. Please remember to subscribe on Google Play, YouTube, or just check us out at hourofhistory.com. Thanks.
Mi corazón todo mi corazón, repito de mis amores, cántame así, con el amor, repito eres mi vida, mi cariño, no me convenido, el mar es repito mi corazón.